City Council. I am happy and proud to report and to provide to you the recommended budget in accordance with Texas statute and the City of Sugar Land Charter. The proposed budget for fiscal year beginning October 1, 2017. The budget for fiscal year 18 complies with City Council adopted financial management policy statements and begins incorporating proposed changes to financial strategies that build resilience for uncertain times and ensures that the city's financial stability is maintained into the future. The budget maintains existing service levels and implements City Council priorities. The budget continues to maintain outstanding city services for residents and visitors, ensures continued financial strength by meeting all fund balance requirements, and is structurally balanced. It's been nearly 25 years ago that city leaders proposed and voters approved an innovative and opportunistic financial strategy. At the time, with a 50-cent property tax rate compared to the 31-cent that we have today. Back in 1993, voters authorized local option sales taxes, 1/2 cent to reduce property tax and 1/2 cent for economic development. There were actually two elections, one in 93 and one in 95, and there were elements of those two types of local option sales tax on the ballot in 93 and in 95. And so the net result was an increase in the local sales tax rate from 1% to 2%, with a 1/2 cent going for property tax reduction and a 1/2 cent going to economic development through the 4A and 4B corporation. The property tax reduction vote substituted sales tax to pay for city services. The property tax rate was required to be lowered, and it was reduced by 9.2 cents over that period of time through 2017 based on that sales tax income that we received. The economic development sales tax funded the SLDC and 4B corporations that have driven expanded job opportunities, quality of life improvements such as parks and amenities like the Houston Museum of Natural Science and Constellation Field. The decisions that were made back in the 90s allowed Sugar Land to become a regional employment center by providing a revenue stream to promote economic development and corporate relocations to the city, and to become a regional marketplace with the development of First Colony Mall and Town Square, for example. Revenue from this growth and new business activity occurring in our city led to additional property tax reductions of an additional 9 cents for a total of over 18 cents, 9 of which was required by the law. The other 9 cents was because of the economic development that occurred in our city because of the 4A and 4B corporations. In addition to that 9 cents, we also have been able to offer increased exemptions to homeowners, including a 10% homestead exemption and an additional $70,000 exemption for over 65 and disabled residents. The additional revenue also helped to enhance city services, providing for things like sidewalk repairs that were not part of the city's service delivery back in the early 90s, and beautification of right-of-way throughout the city, which was not a city service at the time. Some of the other results that have benefited the residents by the strategy that has been in place now for a quarter of a century is the visitors that come to Sugar Land, that shop, that work, that go to their professional services here in the city, help to pay for the cost of services within the city. So our visitors help to subsidize the service cost. We've been able to provide very high-level services that receive a high rating of satisfaction by our residents through our citizen satisfaction surveys. Over the last 6 years, we've been able to maintain a AAA bond rating for the first time in the city's history. which helps us when we do borrow money to be able to borrow it at the lowest possible rate of interest. And also the declining tax rate environment that we were in allowed us to be able to issue certificates of obligation for capital projects instead of going to the voters for voter authorization and a necessary tax increase whenever we wanted to do a capital improvement. So that's been another benefit that the residents have received. The chart shows the impact that the sales tax for property tax reduction and economic development has had on the city. You can see the vertical axis on the left is the revenue annually, which the election was in 93 and 95, and you can see the revenues beginning to come in for both of those local option sales taxes going through fiscal year 18. And the two lines are illustrating the property tax rate, with the green line indicating the required property tax rate and correlates to the vertical axis on the right. And the red line indicates what the city was able to actually lower the property tax rate to. So we have lowered it as much because of growth in economic development as we did, literally from the revenue from the sales tax for property tax reduction. I'd also highlight the decline in sales tax revenue that you'll notice, and we'll be talking more about this later, moving from year 16 to year 17, 2016, 2017, and that we're projecting to continue into 18. And you'll notice that that little green line, the required property tax reduction, that is indicating that since revenues fell, we're authorized to be able to raise the tax rate to make up for that. And based on earlier discussions with the city council in the spring, it is not our intent to raise the tax rate, and there is not a recommendation to raise the tax rate, even though the revenues from the sales tax for property tax reduction are falling. However, we are recommending, as we have discussed in the past, shifting of 1 cent from the portion of the tax rate that goes to maintenance, from debt to maintenance and operations. As the growth in sales tax has helped us be able to lower the property tax rate from 50 cents to 31 cents today, we believe that's a pretty good success story. But there is another part of this that I think is important to illustrate, and that is the tax rate itself. As I mentioned a moment ago, the tax rate is made up of two pieces. The debt service rate and the M&O rate, or the operating rate. And you'll notice that in the 2001-2002 time period, we actually got the M&O rate all the way down to 9.3 cents. It was at this time when we were receiving double-digit sales tax growth, and we could afford that type of property tax rate to fund operations. Obviously, the situation has evolved since then, and we're not seeing that type of growth in sales tax any longer, but the cost of doing service continues to increase. We recognized at that time that we did have to be careful about the reliance on sales tax because of the volatile nature of it as a revenue stream. And the City Council adopted our financial management policy statements beginning in 2002, setting a cap on what we wanted to see the limit on funding from sales tax for operations expenses. And it had gotten to a high during that early part of 2001, 2002, up to 55%. And as of 2016, we've been able to get it to, I believe you said 46? 46% in 2017. So we've been making progress while at the same time holding the line on the property tax rate, which I think is a very important point to make. Also, regarding property tax, the TML, Texas Municipal League, does an annual survey. This year, 30 cities responded, and of the cities in a population category of 65 to 165, the city of Sugar Land is 18th in population. It has the third highest net taxable value, or tax base, the wealth of the community. That then results in a high value per capita of $143,000 compared to an average of $76,000, and by far the lowest tax rate among the survey group, with the average of cities being in the 56 cent range, and we're down to 31 cents. There is one other city that did not respond to the survey, Tyler, that does have a lower property tax rate than we have, but they're also very reliant upon sales tax like we are. These sales taxes primarily paid by both residents, non-residents, and corporations help buy down our tax bills for both residential and commercial properties. That is the upside. The downside is it leaves us more susceptible to economic change and less resilient when change is occurring. As we discussed in the spring, we are seeing a period of significant change. It is a weakness in our financial planning that we're not anticipating changing either in the short or the long term. I think we need to be prepared over the long term to see soft sales tax, and that is for a variety of reasons, and I've identified some of them here. Less spending at the traditional brick and mortar retail, more online sales with limited sales tax collection. There's an article that you'll be receiving later this week in your FYI information indicating the challenges associated with assessing a sales tax against internet sales. But the more internet sales become predominant, the harder it is going to be to collect sales tax. We're also seeing a reduction in sales tax as oil prices fell, and the businesses that are in our city that provide services in the oil and gas business, we're seeing sales tax reductions in those areas as well. And the demographics of the city are leading toward smaller household sizes and less spending, all of which is causing us to recognize that rather than concentrating on that what worked in the 90s and 10, 20, 25 years ago, we need to be preparing ourselves for what we need to be addressing for the next 25 years. In addition, we're experiencing regular attacks on local control from lawmakers in Austin. Everything from revenue caps to the cap on chickens, which is, again, one of my favorites. You'll recall that local control nowadays includes the legislature adopting or considering rules to say that every household in Sugar Land could have 6 chickens. Now, we got to be careful. It's 6, no more than 6. So we're going to have a cap on our revenues and a cap on the number of chickens. As the city is aging, our infrastructure is aging and requiring greater expenditure both on rehabilitation and reconstruction. And I'm making a distinction there because you'll hear us refer to the rehabilitation expenses that we're transferring to the general fund and the operating budget. Those really should fall more into the category of maintenance and operating expenses because they have a limited ability to extend the life of the asset, a limited ability to justify issuing long-term debt for those. And so we're trying to shift those expenditures back into the general fund where there is a wider array of revenue streams helping to cover it rather than just sales tax which has been our practice in recent years. And we're getting some pushback from the community relative to impacts of growth that we also need to be mindful of, because the growth that occurs needs to be complementary to the quality of life that we want to achieve. All of that needs to be taken into consideration as we're looking toward the future. This chart is illustrative of our projected revenues from sales tax over the 5-year period, beginning with last year's projection from fiscal year 17 to fiscal year 2021. And the first blue line there is the 2017 estimate. That was the estimate that we were looking at and anticipating when the budget was adopted last year and the financial plan was approved as part of that. The red line indicates the estimate that we've put together based on current circumstances. And you will see that over the 5-year period, we're looking at a difference of roughly $15 million over that time period. That is a significant impact to our resources, our revenues, and something that has to be taken into consideration moving forward. So in other words, a downturn in 1 year can affect the trend line moving forward, and that's what we're anticipating to occur. So we have a new strategy that we have been working on for the last few years that is intended to reduce our reliance on sales tax and help us become more resilient to economic changes. This includes reducing our reliance on sales tax for services, including infrastructure rehabilitation, and expanded use of sales tax for one-time capital expenditures. In other words, accumulating anything above a very conservative estimate and then using that to pay cash for capital projects that would otherwise require the issuance of debt. We're currently working with the City Council Finance Committee to propose policy direction that would be incorporated into the financial management policy statements. Our recommendation has been and will be to take a conservative approach for sales tax forecasting. The budgeted revenue for next year is estimated at the actual for 2017 or our projected actual for 2017. We maintain that same level of sales tax collections all the way through the end of next fiscal year and only allow projected growth to be included beginning in fiscal year 19. That way, if there are any changes that need to be made, we would be able to manage over a longer period of time to deal with those rather than having to have policies in place that, for example, stop sidewalk repairs, which is the type of situation that we've been experiencing recently. Additionally, we've transitioned the rehabilitation funding from sales tax to property tax and other more stable revenues within the general fund so that they can be built into the operating budgets for the departments. The longer-term major reconstruction work will continue to be included in the capital improvement program, and we will implement our asset management program to make sure that we're making wise reinvestment decisions for both current and future residents. Other elements in the strategy include infrastructure asset management. The new strategy incorporates increased accountability. Through our operational assessments, we've identified improvements to efficiencies such as the way we do minutes, and we've been able to reassign some resources that have been devoted in the past to preparation of minutes to some very significant needs within the records management area. Another example of efficiencies that have come out of our departmental assessments are the fire department staffing and deployment models that have been now confirmed and supported by the assessment conducted by a third party. Yesterday, we launched the Goal Measures dashboard on the city website, providing for increased accountability and transparency to the public on 30 key operations tied to the City Council's midterm priorities. This will assist management and elected officials in making data-driven decision-making on key priority areas. At the same time, we've implemented departmental performance measures where I'm holding departmental directors accountable for operational performance that may not rise to the level of council priorities, but are still important to ensure acceptable service delivery and accountability. And it's just part of just getting better as an organization, which we constantly strive for. We're using citizen engagement to help guide our decision-making, whether it be in the use of voter-authorized debt for capital projects like the Parks Bonds project that we instituted a little while back. As we look forward, we need to build resiliency into our finances through continued economic development programs, smart public-private partnerships, and development of land that produces high taxable values and further promote Sugar Land as a destination city. Additionally, we need to encourage smart redevelopment of our aging retail centers to continue to support our economic health. This is a long-term objective, and we won't get there overnight, but we need to continue to promote these ideas. Now so the next steps will be to update the financial management policy statements, adopt future land use plan and begin implementation. There's some very specific recommendations regarding redevelopment and the use of activity centers for more intense economic development activities, adopt our corporate communications plan, and achieve priority projects that have been on the drawing board with funding for opportunities as needed, including the Imperial Market, second Hotel Conference Center project, the Telfair Track 5 Commercial Tours 4, development of the Central Prison Unit property into a business park, and seeing the Fleur and Schlumberger projects come to fruition. All of those are in the works at different points of their development right now, and we hope to see them moving forward in the coming year. Now I'm going to give you the benefit of hearing from Jennifer Brown and tell you more specifics about the fiscal year 18 budget and the 5-year financial plan.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Alan. All right, so now we're going to get into the numbers, everybody's favorite part. Now, I do want to remind you that this is an overview, and we're going to go through this in much more detail through a series of 5 budget workshops during the month of August. So I don't expect all of you to absorb all of this tonight. But there is a test at the end. No, just kidding.
So
when I'm
Jennifer,
finished,
just for the benefit, so this is required by our charter
It
for our
is.
city manager to introduce the budget. We go through, I think it's 5 budget workshops that have been scheduled. They're on the Thursday of every week in August
5 Thursdays in August.
from 7:30 to 9:30.
Yes.
Where we go through it line item by line item and department by department. So this is, as you said, a robust overview, but the actual details, which culminates in adopting a budget and establishing a tax rate to fund that budget.
Yes. And at the end of this presentation, we will pass out lots of reading material for you to take home with you. And the proposed budget will be posted on the city's website for public consumption. Okay. So each year, City Council and staff spend a tremendous amount of effort planning for and preparing the annual budget. The annual budget is a responsibility of the city manager. This is spelled out in our charter. And a tremendous amount of effort goes into the budget to ensure that what is funded meets the needs of our residents and visitors while also being fiscally conservative. This year's budget process actually started out last fall when we did the budget workshops for the annexation in October of 2016. So going into this spring, we knew that building in the items that were identified in the annexation budget would be top priority for inclusion in the fiscal year 2018 budget. The main priority outside of annexation is to ensure that the budget provides for the service needs and priorities of the city, ensuring stability and resources to support these needs, and continuing our capital investment into the city's infrastructure. I'm pleased to say that we are fully able to implement the annexation decision that was made in November, along with these other priorities, with the annexation-related expenses being supported by debt reduction funds that have been set aside for that specific purpose. To ensure that we maintain our financial strengths, we need to make some changes to the strategy that Alan talked about earlier in our financial management policy statements. So at the spring retreat, we talked about shifting a portion of the tax rate from debt service to maintenance and operations. So we have incorporated that into the proposed budget. We'll also have some strategies that we'll need to incorporate into the financial management policy statements as we move into that update, which we'll be going over with you with you this fall. And so as Alan mentioned, we've already reviewed some of the draft language on some of the points that we've gone ahead and incorporated into the budget, and we'll be finishing that update and reviewing that with you later this year. Keeping those policies and strategies up to date ensures that we are able to be flexible and that we are able to navigate the waters from our changing environment that is always changing due to economic and legislative changes, as Alan mentioned. Okay, so the proposed budget begins by shifting the recurring infrastructure rehabilitation that has historically been funded by in the pay-as-you-go capital improvement program, which is reliant on sales tax, to the general fund operating budget. The shift in the tax rate allocation allows these rehabilitation projects to be funded from a more stable source of revenue, which is only partially dependent on sales tax, whereas right now they're 100% dependent on sales tax. And so that in turn reduces our reliance on sales tax to maintain our infrastructure. And so that change in strategy is that the sales tax that is received over the budgeted amount can be set aside for pay-as-you-go projects the following year rather than the same year. And so that money will be in the bank before we spend it. Since sales tax makes up such a large proportion of our budget, we'll start there as far as revenue assumptions goes. And you've kind of seen the preview for the sales tax with the graph that Alan showed you, and you'll see that chart again in my section. So based on our current trends, which at this point we have 10 months of sales tax checks in the bank, we are anticipating ending the year with $48.6 million in total sales tax revenue. This is 4.868% less than we had budgeted for the year at $50.9 million. So then for fiscal year 18, following our new proposed strategy, we're assuming zero growth in the base and then adding in around $800,000 from a 9-month impact of annexation revenues for a total revenue estimate for fiscal year 18 of $49.4 million. And I'm sorry, that should say 800,000, not 80,000. No, I'm sorry, it's total of eight. Okay, I got it. I'm sorry. 734,000 plus 80,000 from retail. Okay, got it. It is 800,000. Okay, I looked up and saw that 80,000 and it threw me. I think I wouldn't have put this together or something. All right, so here's the same chart that we saw in Alan's section. And so the idea, as he previewed with you is that we're more conservative in the near term and then a little more optimistic in the out years because we're not actually budgeting those, but that allows us to do our planning that we need to do because we know that we're going to need to do some things in the out years, like plan to give employee raises and build in increased cost of benefits, and then we're going to have contractual increases. So it's not really a realistic forecast unless you can build those things in. In order to do that, you have to assume some growth in your revenue streams to be able to support it. So ideally, we'll see that. We'll reset each year. We'll even see more than that, even ideally, yes. But we'll reset each year, and so then this gap that you're seeing here, hopefully they'll come closer together. We won't have a reduction, but then it basically pushes that out. So you're going to stay flat and then have your growth in the out years. And that you're not artificially growing when you don't know if it's going to come in. So it's a more conservative approach to budgeting a very volatile revenue stream. All right, so the current financial management policy statement guidelines provide that we use, that the city manager recommend a tax rate that the city's finances require to be able to meet the council's expectations of services. Just paraphrasing what the excerpt up there says. The overall goal is to have no greater than an average 3% increase in the residential tax bill, unless the voters approve a general obligation bond referendum. Now, this year, we don't have an impact from the general obligation bonds, so we're not recommending a tax increase, and we're not recommending anything greater than the average 3% increase. Now, this is more stringent than is currently being proposed at the state level from the state legislature. If the legislature does place a cap on our ability to levy taxes, we'll probably want to look at changing this policy in the future. Without that threat, I would say no, let's don't change it. But with that imminent threat, that's something that we're going to want to look to as we go through this special session, which we'll know in about 30 days, I think, how we end up there. Okay, so with that proposed tax rate, we're proposing keeping the tax rate flat at the 31,595. Our average home value for 2017, this is information coming from the Central Appraisal District based on the latest preliminary roll that we've received, is $386,835. With our 10% homestead exemption, that gives us a taxable value of $348,152. So that equates to a 2017 tax bill of $1,100. With an over 65 or disabled person's exemption, it works out to $879. So that's what we're going forward with. Once we receive the certified tax roll, we'll obviously have to recalculate this. Will give us all new numbers. So this number may change by the time we actually review property tax and debt service in the second week of August. But this is based on the latest information that we had from the first week in July. Okay. So as we move into fiscal year 18, let's start with talking about how we're going to end fiscal year 17. You're aware that our sales tax is performing lower than anticipated, but additionally, the slowdown in the economy is resulting in a slowdown in building permits as well. We're also seeing fines and forfeitures coming in less than budgeted, so we're having to adjust that in our year-end projections. And according to financial management policy statements, which outlines the reductions that should be made if our revenues should fall short, and also identifies the priority in which those actions should be taken, we are reducing the pay-as-you-go capital improvements funding to offset that decline. And as a result of that, we're planning to end fiscal year 17 within budget and at our budgeted fund balance levels, thanks to that reduction in pay-as-you-go CIP. So then that puts us into our revenue assumptions for fiscal year 18. So we're following the financial management policy statement direction. We're using our revised direction on revenue for estimation for sales tax, keeping it flat from FY17 plus the growth from annexation. We're keeping our property tax revenue assumptions using 3% residential and 3% commercial revaluation, which is what we've been seeing on the preliminary rolls. Maintaining our 10% homestead exemption and the flat tax rate. Reallocating 1 cent from the debt service component to the operating component. And then, as I said, we'll have the certified roll. I think we're actually scheduled to get that next week. And I'll update you during the budget workshops on how that actually ends up. We have no changes to water and wastewater rates, no changes to our surface water or GRP fees. And since 2011, since we've been implementing the surface water rates, we have not raised our water and wastewater rates. And that is a direct result of the water and wastewater rate study that we had done 10 years ago in 2007. And that rate design that was adopted by City Council at that time has us recovering between 35 and 40% of our revenue from our base rates. And so that leaves us to where we're not in a bad position at all if we have a wet year and our volumetric revenue is down. And so we've been in a very healthy position because of the decisions that were made 10 years ago. On the user fee side, we are recommending some increases that are tied to CPI and the general fund. We'll be reviewing those with the Finance Audit Committee next week, and then we'll be highlighting the any fees of note in the budget workshops. And then that will come to you for the first reading of the fee ordinance at the first meeting in September, so that you can have the second reading concurrent with the budget adoption at the second meeting. Our residential solid waste fees are increasing 2.5%, and that is based on the contract with Republic. And this will be effective for bills issued after January 1, 2018. The rate will go from $18 per month to $18.45 per month. This graph provides a visual representation of the major revenue sources and how they're allocated. The blue is property tax, which goes to the general fund and the debt service funds. The red is sales tax, and you can see that goes between the general fund and the 4A and 4B corporations. Purple is user fees and charges for services, and the orange is annexation related, and green is other taxes and franchise fees that show up in the general fund. Out of the $91 million in budgeted general fund revenue, 25% is coming from property taxes, 41% from sales tax, 7% from other taxes, 19% from fees and other sources, and then 8% is annexation related based on reimbursements from the debt reduction funds for the annexation related costs. The debt service funds, which includes the taxable debt service fund, now that we have the taxable debt, it's being repaid by the rent revenue from the Smart Financial Center. So that is what the purple in the debt service funds represents. And then the property taxes represent 57% of the revenue. 25% of the revenue in the debt service funds are annexation related, and that is the MUD tax levies for that fiscal year 18 debt service. And because the city won't levy a tax in the annexed areas until fiscal year 19. And then economic development corporations, we have the majority coming from sales tax, but we do have about 11% coming from other sources, and that is the reimbursement from Town Square TERS to the corporations for infrastructure. And then utility and airport funds are 100% user fee supported. There are no property taxes going into those funds. The operating budget contains the funding that is necessary to maintain our existing service levels that are defined in our departmental business plans based on consistent direction from City Council on expected levels of service. These levels of service don't change without input and concurrence from City Council. The funding totals $208.6 million across all funds, which encompasses general fund, water utilities, surface water, airport, and solid waste, just to name a few. Additions to the budget are focused on adjusted fixed costs, such as contracts that have increased, and there are extremely select increases to the base budgets in some funds. You'll see that in the airport. And we've also built in the increases to serve the annexed areas in the budget. And as I mentioned, those costs to serve the annexed areas are being funded by the debt reduction funds in the first year. And here is an overview of the proposed budget, and we have our 5 major operating fund types, including utility and surface water funds being combined. And then we have our solid waste fund, corporations, and then all of the other funds, which would be our special revenue funds and our internal service funds are included in the other funds. And that totals the $208.6 million, with the general fund making up $87.6 million of that. The capital projects budget that is included in fiscal year 18 totals $22.4 million to give us a total of $231 million. And we will go into more detail on those, but I just wanted to show you the total tonight. And then I want to highlight a few of the additions that we've built in.
Jennifer, and that compares, if you look at that with our budget last year, so the operating funds were $186 million. CIP was 73, and it was about a $260 million budget. So what you're seeing is, and that's with this budget now including the annexations of 2 major areas. So you're seeing both a drop in terms of the revenue, which we discussed in our strategic plan last year, but you're also seeing the flexibility that's in the financial management policy statements, giving us the flexibility to adjust our budget in order to come with a structurally balanced budget, which Alan's required to do by law.
Okay. In the general fund, our additions are focused on maintaining service levels. As I mentioned, there are a few select areas that did receive increased funding, and those are mainly due to increases that are out of our control, such as contractual increases like you saw earlier this year with the right-of-way maintenance contract, where that cost increased substantially. So we had to increase the budget to be able to fund that. Or the end of agreements that are exempted from that have previously exempted the city from paying for certain services, which would be our Comcast agreement. We've not had to pay for any of our services from Comcast under the previous agreement with them. They notified us last year that they were no longer going to offer those services at no cost to us, but we were able to defer that cost until fiscal year 18 because we had already approved the budget last year. And so beginning in October, we'll need to fund that cost. And that is for our fiber optic service that we have to all of our buildings, that all of our IT communications networks run over the fiber optic cables. The main impact to the general fund is from annexation, and that includes all the new positions that are in the budget that were added mid-year this year in the annexation budget, and are being proposed for fiscal year 18, consistent with what you saw at the annexation budget workshops. The other addition to the general fund is for infrastructure rehabilitation that was previously funded in the capital improvement program. Okay. This chart illustrates where the funds go. So the figures, and this is general fund, the operating budgets for the various departments. The red is the proposed budget for fiscal year 18, and the blue is the projection for fiscal year 17, which includes the annexation budget that was funded for this year. And so I do want to point out that at the top of the chart, 47% of the general fund operating budget goes to fund public safety, which would include fire, police, or fire and EMS, police, and public safety dispatch. And public safety dispatch is lumped in with police for the purposes of this chart. Within those departments, between 91 and 93% of their budgets is personnel. And it's because that's just the nature of what they do. And so that covers salary and benefits for all the public safety personnel. Overall, for the general fund operating budget, 76% of funds go to personnel for salaries and benefits. And again, it's because we are a service industry, basically. You know, we're providing services to our residents, and that takes people. We contract out what we can, but when we have recurring costs like that, it does require a stable funding source. And so that's why we're proposing shifting some of the more stable property tax revenue into the general fund so that we can ensure that we're not having to go in and interrupt services due to a future downturn in the economic cycle. So as we get into the budget workshop, we'll get into each of these areas and give you a better feel for what's being included in each and how they're increasing. And I do also want to point out that there is one reduction on this chart. While Parks is staying the same, and general government is going down from the projection for this year. So I always have to point out a decrease whenever we have one. The proposed budget includes the addition of 19.5 new positions in fiscal year 18. It brings us to a total of 798.5 full-time equivalent positions, and that includes all the positions added for annexation. This gives us 6.77 full-time equivalent employees per 1,000 residents after the annexation. And for reference, I have added in the current FTE column is our 2017 population and the staffing per 1,000 that the original FY17 budget was based on without the annexation positions. We were at 8.24 per 1,000 prior to making any changes for annexation. And then adding the population and the staffing will be at 6.77. So we're actually bringing our staffing level down. And then we'll discuss all of these new positions with you through the budget workshops. All right, then, as I said, the major additions are annexation related. This is the addition for the general fund. We have $475,000 in one-time expenses, $2.6 million in recurring costs, and that comes to a total of $3.1 million for fiscal year 18. The majority of this is being funded by the debt reduction funds that were set aside by the districts, not by property taxes. In the utility fund, annexation increases total $3.6 million. And again, some of these costs will be reimbursed by the debt reduction funds, but the majority of them will be covered by utility bills that will begin being paid by these residents because they'll be part of our utility system after annexation, and they'll be paying the city's utility rates. And so those will go into this fund, which will cover the cost of providing services. In the solid waste fund, the total cost increase is $1.6 million. We have $14,300 in one-time costs, $1.53 million in recurring, and most of this cost will be covered from the charges for services. But if you'll recall from the discussion with the Best Trash contract for serving Greatwood, there will be a small subsidy on those services, and we will be reimbursing from the debt reduction funds to cover that. And as I mentioned, the airport is the one area that has increases that are not annexation related. They have a total of $440,000 in one-time expenses proposed, with recurring increases of $8,250. Again, the airport is a self-supporting enterprise fund. It's not supported by property or sales taxes, and we'll get into the detail on these during the budget workshops. And finally, on the operating budget, we have employee compensation and benefits. So since employees are our greatest asset, we are including in the budget a 3% merit pool, which will fund our pay for performance system. You'll recall the city does not give cost of living increases, and so the merit increases, other than promotion, the merit increases are our employees' only opportunity to receive any kind of pay raise. We're also implementing compensation plan updates, which result in our fire and police salary structures returning to the 75th percentile in the market for starting pay, which has been identified as a priority for City Council. Both of these increases will be effective January 1 and can be funded within that 3% of salary figure that we have built into the budget. We are also anticipating, based on information from our health insurance consultant, benefits costs will be increasing about 4% in 2018. This will be on the city side only. We're not passing any of this increase on to our employees. And the city's TMRS required contribution will be increasing just slightly in January of 2018, and that is that rate is defined by the actuarial study that is done for our city based on our plan and our funding percentage. And at the end of December of last year, and those funding ratios are calculated annually based on the TMRS calendar year. They're on a calendar year, fiscal year. And so as of December 31st of last year, we are 86% funded. We are on track to become 100% funded by the end of our closed amortization period, which was a 30-year period, that started, do you remember what year it was? 2009, I want to say?
Something like that.
Yeah, so we're probably almost 10 years into that funding period, but we're paying the full rate and we're closing the gap. The funding ratio can change from year to year based on actuarial assumptions, based on longevity of assumed longevity of employees to the rate of return assumed on the plan on those investments. And so the latest report that we have shows that we're 86% funded, and that's a very healthy funding rate. The proposed CIP for 2018 totals just under $22.4 million, and that includes issuance costs for the bonds that will be sold to fund the projects. This year, water and wastewater projects account for 46% of the funding. Streets follows with 19%, and municipal has just slightly less than that at 17%. And we're continuing to invest in drainage with another 10% of funding being allocated there at $2.2 million. I do want to also point out that within the municipal funding, we have funding for an interim gun range construction for the public safety training site and planning dollars for implementation of the license plate recognition camera system. And I know that both of these have been identified by City Council as priorities. So I just wanted to point that out. With the decline in sales tax revenues, we're not able to set aside any pay-as-you-go funding from sales tax in fiscal year 18. However, we do have pay-as-you-go funding from our enterprise funds, along with 4B corporation funding. So our pay-as-you-go and corporation funding accounts for 20% of the funding for the out of that $22.4 million. Revenue bonds make up 20%. And COs will cover 36%, with the remaining 24% coming from other sources such as fund balance and third parties like the Cullinan Foundation. The charter requires that a 5-year CIP be included with the filed budget and adopted with the annual budget. The fiscal year 18 to 22 5-year CIP totals $130.6 million. I do want to point out that this number is included for planning purposes Only the first year of the plan is adopted and funded within the annual budget, but we do fiscally constrain all 5 years of the plan, of the program, within our financial forecast. Additionally, we're only including projects for funding as a general rule once we have completed 60% design, because by then we have a really good estimate on construction. Over the 5-year period, streets and drainage continue to be a priority with nearly 45% of funding. Our water, wastewater, and surface water follow with a combined 29%, followed by municipal at 13.6%, and parks at 11.7%, and that will conclude implementation of the voter-approved GO bond projects. That is anticipated to occur in fiscal year 19. We also would need a 1-cent tax increase in fiscal year 19 to be able to move forward with that final phase. The funding sources for the 5-year program, we have 55% funded from the issuance of certificates of obligation, 8% from the voter-approved GO bonds, and then revenue bonds make up 19%, and other revenue sources, which is the pay-as-you-go from enterprise funds, corporation funding, and other sources, making up the remaining 18%. So here are some key dates on when you'll see budget-related items on the regular council agenda. We'll come back on August 15th and hold a public hearing on the proposed budget. Then on August 22nd, which is a workshop, but we'll need to utilize that meeting to hold the first public hearing on the proposed tax rate. And we'll also hold the public hearing on the PID assessment, which is for the enclave at River Park. Based on the tax calendar that's put together, historically we've needed to utilize that meeting in order to not have to hold a special meeting to accommodate these public hearings. Then on September 5th, we'll have the second public hearing on the proposed tax rate. We'll ask you to amend the fiscal year 17 budget to projections, and we'll have the first reading of the fee ordinance. And then on September 19th, we'll wrap it up with approval of the fiscal year 18 budget, the 5-year CIP, and the compensation plans. We'll ask you to adopt the tax rate, and we'll have the second reading of the fee ordinance. We'll also have the PID assessment on there as well, but I didn't include that. I ran out of room. Okay, so Mayor mentioned the budget workshops. We do have those scheduled for the 5 Thursdays in August. They will be in the Kane Room here at City Hall from 7:30 to 9:30 a.m. And you can see the topics as we have those listed here. If we need to change topics, we'll let you know, but at this point, this is the schedule we're planning to follow. This will keep us on track for getting the tax rate and the budget adopted in a timely manner, which we do have statutory requirements, charter requirements on how we need to get those adopted.
And Jennifer, those meetings are open to the public.
Yes, sir, they are. And with that, we have a lot of work to do over the next couple of months, but at this time, Alan and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Amy?
Yeah, just one, well, it's kind of a multi-part. Our sales tax recovery is down. When I started, 2011, what was our homestead exemption?
I remember
Probably
5%?
Probably, about
Yeah, I think
5%, but we
Yeah.
can identify that.
Where I'm going with this is, and then 2 years ago, we increased it to maybe 8%, and then last year, we increased it to 10%. And I am curious why you're not suggesting we go back to a smaller exemption, like 8%, so that we can actually cover some of the CIP that we had to knock off.
Okay.
To me, it is strictly a policy decision that the city council makes as to the portion of the burden of city services that you want to place on residential versus commercial and business properties. That's literally what the homestead exemption does. So it really is more about the policy that you have for that. We put a lot of effort into our economic development programs. One of the main reasons we do that is to help generate revenues, to help subsidize services for residential costs. And it's just a question of how far you want to go. Some cities have gone to the full statutorily authorized homestead exemption of 20%. If I remember correctly, Fort Bend County has a 20% homestead exemption. If you were to approve a 20% homestead exemption, you could do that and raise the property tax rate and end up in an equal position for the homeowner's tax bill and just reallocate who's paying for it.
Just shift to
So
commercial.
it's really not as much, the way I look at it, about revenue collection as it is the allocation of the tax burden. And that's totally up to city council. Up to this point, the city council has decided to go to 10%. You may decide to stay there. There may be limitations depending upon what the legislature does on rolling that back. But again, it's really going to come down to how you want to handle the allocation of the burden.
I don't want to increase the burden on our taxpayers, but I also see that if we're not bringing in the sales tax, now we're having to shift everything. We need to really look at how we are handling our financial matters. So what I would like to know is the difference in taxes, like play with that a little bit. I'd like to know if we had a 9%
Okay.
tax homestead exemption, what would be the impact to the
Sure,
city?
we can
versus
calculate
the
those numbers for
taxpayer.
you and provide them to you.
And so just because limited funds coming in and we're cutting back on a lot, and there's some very serious projects. I mean, part of the reason I think our CIP was so high last year was because we were building the Performing Arts Center. And so, yeah, now we had a big drop, we're not building it anymore. But there are a lot of things that we had said we're going to be doing that now we had to pull back and we're not going to be doing. And that makes me nervous in terms of what we've cut back on. And
Right.
I know you're working hard on that
Right.
to make sure
One of the,
everything's taken care of.
Things that we've done and have discussed with you in earlier conversations is basically took what was a 4-year CIP and stretched it to 5 years. So we haven't eliminated any projects. We've basically delayed some projects from a 4-year plan to a 5-year plan. But you're getting the grip on what all of the issues are that we're going to be looking at, not only this summer, but into the fall as we revisit the policies. And it's going to be an ongoing conversation as long as the changes that are occurring in the marketplace out there continue.
I just say a well-informed decision is the best decision to make.
bet.
And if we just lock in on one idea, perhaps we need to look at other ones as well. I'm not really eager to increase the tax rate. I understand what you're saying about we could increase the homestead exemption, put higher burden on commercial businesses. I don't know the impact of that, but I just think we really need to look about how we are doing our finances to address the sales tax loss, because it's huge. It's in the millions, and I understand that.
Yes, ma'am.
So, it's just my comments and questions. Thank you.
Steve?
Thank you. One of the areas that I would really like to talk about in our forthcoming discussions is what strategies are you implementing that allow us to maintain our service level when the number of FTEs per 1,000 residents drops fairly precipitously? And I don't, is that something that would be in one of these 5 sessions?
Yes.
Which one will?
I think it was really more what we
Across.
talked about last year
Yeah.
when we put together the annexation plan.
Yeah. We can run through all
But we
that
can go
again.
back over it.
Again, my concern, I think I said something then, and I'll say it again. We have a champion workforce that's been recruited, that's been trained well, it's motivated well, and I don't want to burn them out.
I totally understand, and that's why we had each one of the department heads stand in front of you and tell you what it is that they needed to provide services to those areas, as opposed to it coming from me. So
Okay.
we can get them back up there and have them tell you that again,
Yeah.
and answer any other questions that you might have.
Good. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.